Hello, and welcome to Small Town Gospel Podcast. I'm Alana. Today you'll be listening to part 1 of a 2-part series on different English Bible translations. Today's episode will be more of a history and terminology lesson that hopefully will set us up for next week's discussion on how all of this applies to our everyday life here in a small town. We hope you enjoy, and as always, if you have any questions or comments, please reach out to us at smalltowngospel@gmail.com or on our social media platforms. Thanks! Hello, and welcome to another episode of Small Town Gospel Podcast. I'm Alana, here with Alex, and today we're talking about different English translations of the Bible.
Yeah, it's good to be with you today, and we've got a few people actually request this specific topic, and it is certainly relevant because everything we believe about God's Word, that it is inerrant, that it is sufficient, that it is the source of authority for things in the Christian life, we better have a pretty good, clear-eyed understanding of the Bible that we hold in our hands and how it came to be in our hands. And just by way of means of appreciation, understanding that the Bibles that we have in our possession today are the result of a ton, not only of academic hard work and translation and missionary effort, but of bloodshed. So we have our Bibles because many, many people gave their lives to spread the gospel through the spread of Scripture. So Alana is kind of our resident expert on the history of it, so she'll be leading this first part of the discussion, and then I will be kind of leading the charge on the second part, where we get into the issues when it comes to the modern effort of translating and the philosophy of translations and the implementation in local churches of that. So, Alana, if you would kind of lead the discussion through a fly overview of the history.
Yeah, so I'm just going to be covering what we would consider the main English Bible translations that we see in our predominant circles. So, KJV, NKJV, ESV, NASB, NIV. There's obviously so many more translations other than that, but I figured I would just share the history of what I know and what I'm more comfortable with. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to us and ask us about other translations. But the first predominant English translator was William Tyndale, and he was the one that began the work of translating the Old Testament into Old English in about 1525. And over the next 25 years, he would continue to work on translating the New Testament. And as he translated, there are some controversial translation choices that he made, but his work was very, very diligent and very thorough at the time. And his work influenced majorly what would be known as the King James Version later. So in 1535, the version called the Great Bible was published, and it was the majority of Tyndale's work. Up to that point, he hadn't finished all of the New Testament, and it also had catechisms and a few other things in it that we do not have in our current Bibles. And it had a fun little tribute page at the beginning of the Bible for King Henry VIII, who was the King of England at the time. It had his picture, and that was the start of the Bible, which is just so interesting.
It is interesting just in general. Sorry to interrupt our expert here, but the way that political shenanigans intermingle with, it's obviously sacred and holy and reverent, and yet God works in and through some pretty messy political situations to bring God's word to us. So anyway, keep going.
Yeah, we will continue to see that in pretty much every translation there is. So after the 1539 Great Bible was published, between the years of 1557 and 1575, the Geneva Bible was translated and published, and this translation was brought forth throughout the Protestant Reformation period, and it was then used by the Pilgrims who traveled over to America, and that was the version of the Bible that they used to found the American colonies, which I thought was a really interesting fact. And then in 1604 was when the commissioning of the King James Version of the Bible began. So the commission came from the King of England at the time, who was King James, hence King James Version. And he put together this team of theologians and professors and other really smart guys, and they then worked until the first edition of the King James Version was published in 1611, but then there were many revisions the next 100 years after that that were all known as the King James Version. We skip forward a few years to 1885, where we see the first major English revision of the King James Version, which was called the English Revised Bible. And the way I say English is because it was by England that, England revised it, so it was an English language. And then in 1901, we see the American Standard Version being published, and it was the first major American revision of the King James Version. And if you're looking at American history during this time, the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, there's just this major thing happening in America where America's being settled and becoming their own country away from the British government. And as history plays out, it's just really interesting to see this race, not only in politics, but also in Bible translations. So right after the English made their revision of the King James Version, then the Americans, right after that, came out with their own revision of the King James Version.
It's like the space race, but with the Bible.
Yeah, which was just so interesting that this was happening at the same time as major historical events that we study in school. So then in 1952, there was a revision. It's called the Revised Standard Version, which is the revision of that ASV that we talked about a little before. And its goal was to preserve the English Revised Version while also making the language usable in public worship and private worship, meaning that it would be relatable to those listening and those studying. So then, this is a long-winded story. In 1955, the commissioning of the NIV Bible began by a man named Howard Long, and his quest was fueled by his passion for sharing the gospel. So he was sharing the gospel with people who had no religious background, and he wanted a translation of the Bible that would be written in a more contemporary language that could be used across denominational use and in evangelistic use, that people could common people who had no biblical background could relate to. And so his NIV version was published and distributed in 1965, but he began his work in 1955. Then we get to 1963, where the New American Standard Bible was commissioned. And we talked about the American Standard Version just a little bit before this. This is obviously a revision of that. And it was officially published. So the work began in 1963. It was officially published in 1971. And then in 1982, the new King James Version arrived on the streets. And its goal was to stay as close to the King James Version as possible, while also updating to a more advanced or modern English language. And so this was also because there had been so many other translations coming out, that they wanted to take the moment to go back to the roots, while also appealing to all of the reasons why all these other versions were being made, which I thought was interesting. They kind of like said, wait a minute, and went back to the KJV. And then in the 1990s, the idea for the English Standard Version began when the president of Crossway Ministries saw a need for a literal translation using different Christian scholars who had been studying the original texts, and they came together and they used translators and scholars and pastors and all of these really smart guys to take the 1971 Revised Standard Version and create the English Standard Version, which was then published and released in 2001. So there's our flyover.
Yeah, and obviously there's a whole history before Tyndale ever showed up on the scene of the different views of whether even the common man should have the Bible in their own language, and there's just a whole lot going on there. But for our English speaking American Christian experience, that's a really good overview, and gives some appreciation for where we're at today. And so as we get into now, in 2021, some of the relevant things to consider kind of behind the scenes. So we just saw the history of where all these translations come from. Now I'll lead kind of a discussion about what goes on in the meeting rooms. There's a whole bunch of red tape and discussion and debate that goes on. Anytime a new Bible comes out, it represents thousands and thousands of man-hours of preparation and study and debate on every single passage. And so I'll discuss some of those discussions and what leads to the translations that we end up with. So one of, at the very foundation of these processes is manuscripts, and this whole field of study and inquiry called textual criticism. And what that is it's the the scholarly attempt and effort to best identify what the original manuscripts of the Bible said. Keep in mind that everything that Orthodox Christians believe about the Bible, we believe them about the original autographs. So what the Apostle John, for instance, actually sat down and wrote in his Gospel, in his 3 letters, and in the book of Revelation, that document that he touched and wrote on with his own hands, that is what we believe is inerrant. That is what we believe is sufficient. That is what we believe is the very Word of God. So in a sense, what we believe that about is true of the Bibles that we have in our possession only insofar as they accurately convey what was originally communicated. So textual criticism is the academic effort to most accurately preserve and disseminate the original manuscripts. And so there's essentially three general approaches to this process. Keep in mind the way that we find this is through biblical archaeology. So they do digs and they find these ancient documents. And the three primary methods of textual criticism, there is what's called textus receptus, there is the majority text, and there is the critical method. Textus receptus is essentially the effort to find the earliest and best original sources, get as close to the original as you possibly can. And so if you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was a really big deal because they found more manuscripts and earlier manuscripts than they've ever found before. And so it's basically if a major event happened in your local town and there were all these eyewitnesses who wrote down in their journals about it, and that they wrote it like the next day, the philosophy behind textus receptus would be the belief that would be the most reliable rather than what a whole bunch of people had to say that wrote it down 50 years after the fact. So that's textus receptus. You're trying to get as early as you possibly can in the original languages to when the event happened. The majority text method is literally if textual criticism or manuscripts were a pure democracy, it would be the majority text. So literally, if you find a manuscript, that manuscript gets a vote. And so whatever manuscript has the most votes, like whatever manuscript is most commonly discovered out there, is regarded as the right, the correct manuscript. The problem with that is the way that these things happen is there's the original document and then scribes copy it. And if you get one mistake early on, then every copy of that mistake is counted. And so there are currently no major translations that use the majority text exclusively as their method of translation. The third method is known as the critical, or you could also call it the eclectic method, which is an attempt, this is what New American Standard, NIV, ESV, they use this approach, where it leans toward the textus receptus, but they also just try to account for the different variables in the given situation. So those are the three approaches. All of our translations that would be most common in our church would be from this critical method. The King James would be the major translation that uses the textus receptus exclusively. And that gets into some of the reasons why there's this notion out there of King James onlyism, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. So thank you for bearing with us so far on the history and on kind of the technical stuff. Now just things that get a little bit more interactive. So there's a philosophy. Once you kind of once a translator and a team of translators identifies what they want to do and what textual criticism method they're going to use in their translation, there then is a philosophy of translation, and there's the range of formal equivalence, dynamic equivalence, and paraphrase. And so formal equivalence would be word order in, let's say, English and Spanish can be different. Mm-hmm. So a formal equivalence would be if someone speaks a sentence in Spanish. Can you speak a sentence in Spanish?
Oh, that's a lot of pressure.
You lived in Phoenix. Come on.
I can speak Spanish, just not on pressure.
Okay. Anyways, let's say there's a sentence in Spanish and the word order is a little bit different than in English. A formal equivalence would translate that into English, and it would sound funny in English. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't sound quite natural because it goes word for word, Spanish to English, and they would say, we want to most accurately, word for word, communicate what was originally said, and in the English you have to do the work of figuring out kind of the sense or the feel of the sentence. Dynamic equivalence would be much more, you say, if I ever could get you to do it, you speak a sentence in Spanish, and then I convey the vibe, the most free-flowing into English idea that you were just communicating, and it would be less, technically speaking, accurate in the original Spanish than it is if you were to take the formal equivalence. Paraphrase is literally just like, here's this whole story, and I'm going to kind of put it in my own words, and the really big idea of the story, theoretically, if I'm a trustworthy paraphraser, would be conveyed, but there's not even an attempt made at saying this sentence has the same words or structure or anything as the original. So yeah, translators have to pick a philosophy, and you can get the idea. There would be, especially those first two, formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence, there's pros and cons for sure to both of those. And what we as English readers have to keep in mind is no matter what you do, something is lost in translation. Yeah. And that's one of the benefits of really good, solid preaching. Mm-hmm. If you have a pastor or a teacher that you trust, spends a lot of time working in the original language, they will try to accurately convey both the technical word-for-word truth as well as the heart of what is being said. Mm-hmm. And it's also why in your own study you should be thankful for your English translation while making sure that you learn how to study it a little bit more for yourself. Yeah,
one of the examples that I was reading in an article as I was studying for this was the word, I'm going to butcher it. Maybe you can help. Agape.
To Theou.
There we go. Which means in an English translation, the love of God. But as you look in the translations that we use, ESV, the love of God, NIV, God's love, another one, love for God, another one, God showed his love, you see what you're just talking about as an example. What literally means the love of God was translated here 5 different times to very similar, it still gets the concept, but it uses all of those approaches in that.
Yeah. And it is interesting, just the subtle little ways that the theological assumptions of the translators come across. Yeah. So one example would be there's various places throughout Paul's letters where he refers to his readers. He says that you are called saints. The King James Version you are called to be saints, which there's that undercurrent, and there is a political motivation there of they were wanting to have a well-behaved group of subjects under this king. And so there's these little insinuations of you kind of need to behave yourself.
Yeah.
Same thing, so ESV, that's what I use. ESV, there are certain passages that would have a range of possible ways of explaining it, and it does tend to lean more toward a reformed soteriology. Whoa, wow, soteriology. Of there could be a range of possible ways of translating it, and it just tends to skew a little bit more on the quote-unquote Calvinistic side. Every translation does it if you care enough to put all the work. Same thing if you watch documentaries.
Yeah.
You should never think, oh boy, I'm hearing a totally neutral thing. If it's totally neutral, they probably didn't... a truly neutral person wouldn't care enough to put all that work into doing something. So people try to be even-handed, but their theology does tend to come out.
Yeah.
So there's the formal equivalents. We're going to be really strict on word for word for word for word. That's why the New American Standard is the most formally equivalent translation we have, and that's why often you're reading it in English and it's like, no one speaks like this.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of read it slowly. But if you're trying to do in-depth study and you don't know Greek, it's going to be as close as you can possibly get to the original Greek in English. So it's really helpful that way. Dynamic equivalents, the best known example that we would have of that would be the NIV, where you really do get the sense of what the author overall was getting at and what his point is, and it rolls off the tongue very naturally in the English language. And children can read it, and they can learn from it at a pretty early age, and it's beneficial that way. But for sure, there are moments where to be able to do that, the translators made decisions that if all you ever did was read your NIV Bible, you wouldn't know the decisions that were made for you before you ever get access to it. So there's all sorts of things that happen behind the scenes before they write it down in the NIV, and you wouldn't know about it. So that's, if you read an NIV, that's totally fine. People I know and love very much, hi Mom, read and benefit greatly from the NIV. But you just need to be aware that has happened before you ever saw it. Decisions were made, more so than the formal equivalents. So one of these concepts would, as teams of translators are deciding what to translate, a really interesting example I heard when I was in college, some missionaries, retired missionaries that had gone to a completely unreached people group in Asia, they communicated and shared, here they're trying to translate the Bible for the very first time into this language, and they run into this really interesting dilemma of, do we translate the exact word that was used in the Greek, even if it conveys something radically different in their language? And the example they gave was, they're in this Asian country where the staple, the main foundational part of their diet was rice. And for dessert, the sweet, tasty morsel that you may or may not have, was bread. So they get to the part where they're translating Christ's statement, I am the bread of life. For Western civilizations, If you remember your food pyramid from elementary school, bread is at the very base of the food pyramid. And so for Jesus' original hearers and for most people in the West, you hear, I am the bread of life, and you go, oh, he's saying that he's
the sustenance,
the absolute basic necessity at the foundation of our life. We need him every day. We need him to nourish us on an ongoing basis. In this Asian country that had no Bible in their language, if someone without a teacher were to read, I am the bread of life, it would be, I'm that little morsel at the end that you can take it or leave it, a little delicacy that perhaps isn't very good for me, that kind of a thing. So they have to make that decision, and I think they ended up deciding to keep it bread and basically convey, you need to study. So these people needed to study and understand, bread here, though we think of bread as a dessert, that's not what he meant.
It means rice, yeah.
Yeah. And so, and I think that's a very good principle to uphold, because once you start saying we're going to put everything in contemporary terms or in terms that suit my experience and my life, you're just on a slippery slope, and you want to convey this is about Jesus and his life and his time, and we have to submit ourselves to that.
And who he was speaking to.
Yeah.
Context.
Right. So that's that example that those missionaries shared stuck with me, because that, it's compelling to think, well, maybe they should have translated it, I am the rice of life. But when you start thinking of the implications of, if you change that, then do you do rice for communion?
Yeah.
And would that matter? And all the ripples go really, really far. And it kind of got to the heart of it. So the first part of this episode was probably a little bit boring and technical, but thank you very much for sticking with us.